Please be seated. This passage, the Road to Emmaus passage, as it's called, is actually one of my favorites in the Bible because it's one of those ones where you just want to put yourself in the place of these two disciples. I mean, think about what an experience that would be. You're walking along, you're all depressed, things have been horrible. The leader of your whole sort of, they would call it a cult, but your group has been killed. You're walking home, basically, and some guy joins you, and you start talking. And even though you think you know more than he does, because he doesn't know all these events you're talking about, he suddenly starts explaining to you what you should have known all along. He starts setting the record straight. This is why the Christ came. This is why the crucifixion took place. This is why, if you had simply been paying attention to what God has been saying all along, you would have known that the resurrection was inevitable. You would have known that what these women were saying is absolutely true, that Christ is risen. Now, you've got all this going on, and as you're listening to this guy, still having no clue who he is, you can just feel the energy, you can feel the excitement, you can feel the sort of blood rising in you in this really positive way, and it is so much to the point that when he gets ready to go on, you're like, no, come on, I want to hear more. Wouldn't that have been a really interesting and cool experience, even though he was schooling you? Even though he was saying, you've been blind. Even though, in a sense, he's been saying, you've kind of been foolish. And yet, what he has said also makes you alive, lights you up. And so you invite him in, and then, now this is the experience that would have been really cool. As he breaks the bread, which would have been done at a meal, he vanishes. How cool is that? And at that moment, you know what you have been in the presence of. You know with whom you have been in the presence. And you're so excited, you just have to go all the way back, just retrace your footsteps to that journey back there and tell everyone. How cool would that have been? But what is really important about this passage isn't so much the Jesus being made known in the breaking of the bread. That's the part we always think of, and that is really cool. But it was Jesus opening their eyes along the way, helping them understand that they had been laboring under misinformation, in a sense, that they had been laboring under a false impression, that they hadn't been paying attention, and that now it was time. In essence, the real point of the story is the setting the record straight so that they could see and make the connections. It's the same thing really with Peter, although Peter has always been somewhat of a clumsy one in the Gospels. I mean, there's the reason he was painted like that. He was the kind of guy who always believed that you did fine work with a hammer. And so his words are not nearly as finessed as Jesus's. But they are still on point. When he's addressing the crowd, and he says, well, I just want to make this clear to you. Let's set this record straight here. That this Jesus, whom you crucified, ouch, is the Christ. Now, that might not have even been a fair statement in a lot of ways to them. And yet it was more fair than even Peter himself knew, because he was addressing a crowd of Jewish people. And one guy in there might have said, listen, I wasn't even in town when this all happened. Why are you blaming me? We hear this sort of stuff all the time. It's not my fault. Peter wasn't blaming everybody individually. But he was saying, and again, in perhaps a way that was deeper than even he understood, that we are all, in fact, those who have crucified Jesus. We always remember this on Good Friday and Palm Sunday by reading the parts where we, the congregation, we, the people, yell, "Crucify him." Remember that? Wasn't that long ago? But the real point of what he is saying is that it didn't matter if they were there in particular. It is that we, as humanity, do in fact hold the responsibility for that crucifixion, because it is we, as humanity, who have walked away from God repeatedly and repeatedly and repeatedly. We keep doing it. And because we keep doing it 2,000 years after the resurrection, we are in fact still those who have crucified Christ. And that's a hard thing to hear, because we don't want to be guilty. But Peter sets the record straight. You can't walk away from this. You can't say, "Oh, it's not my fault." If you're part of the human race, you're part of this problem. The good news is that Jesus is the answer. The good news is that God's love, which is physically incarnate with us, is the answer. But we so often don't even get to the good news part because we're so focused on the part of, "It's not me, I didn't do it. We do this all the time. And we continue to do this. Remember, what was it, a year ago now, a year and a half ago almost, we did that fireside chat where we started talking about slavery in New York? And the Diocese of New York is still grappling with its culpability with slavery, and not only slavery, but the ongoing after effects of slavery, because you could argue it never stopped. Please behave. It never stopped, and we have certain responsibility for where things are now. Certainly, we were not here during the time of slavery, but we are here now. And we are put in a place where we are given the responsibility by God to make sure that those after effects are ameliorated. There we go. We are responsible for our brothers and sisters in whatever way they are suffering. Another example of that is, as you know, yesterday I was in Washington, D.C. at the Climate March. I felt that it was important that at least somebody go as a representative of the church to say it is in fact our Christian duty to be stewards of the environment. In fact, it is in the church's official stances that we as Christians are called to be stewards of the environment, stewards of this earth, because God put us in that position at creation, and that we are responsible for what we hand back to God. And so I felt it was important to go as a representative of the church. What I didn't realize, of course, was that there's a whole section of the parade route for the keepers of the faith. There are clergy all over the place. So I marched with a little band and beat a drum. But it didn't matter. The point was that we are responsible. We didn't create things, the conditions that they are, because we weren't alive at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or even before. But we are responsible for the earth as we find it. And not only that, there was a really fascinating conversation going on amongst these 200,000 people. And one was that environmentalists screwed up. That they were so focused on, let's just, fight in industry and all that sort of stuff, that they missed the whole point of it being not just a matter of the environment, but a matter of justice. And in fact, that sometimes the way environmental folks were approaching things was in fact unjust to some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And so it's a whole reshaping of things. And it is a way of looking at ourselves and saying, I have not been on the right path, and it is time to set it straight. But the first part of that, of course, is acknowledging that anything was wrong in the first place. And that's where we have the hardest problem as human beings. we still say, or at least a very, very small number of people say, nothing we do has ever caused any of this. We deny things. For what it's worth, the church's stance is, oh yes, when we throw things into the environment, it does have an impact. And we are responsible. Maybe not for creating it, but for moving ahead. Those are the responsibilities we have, but it requires first and foremost acknowledging, recognizing what is before us. This is just a small example of this. I mean, I was visiting Margie. I don't think she would be mad at me for this. I was visiting her on Friday, and we were talking about the river. We're looking out of her house at the river. And boy, then she got on the whole Riverkeeper thing and the River at Risk fireside chat. And I thought, man, I got to slow down. She was on fire about it. She says, we are responsible for this river and we had better take care of it. And all I could say was, yes, ma'am. But it's the same thing that Jesus was saying to those disciples. It's the same thing that Peter was saying to his audience, really, that crowd of people who wanted to hear what he said. And that is that you are not responsible for the world that you were born into. You're not responsible, Jesus said to Cleopas and the other unnamed partner, for what happened up until the time you got on the scene. But you are responsible for knowing. You are responsible for having paid attention to the prophets. God gave you the prophets for a reason. You are responsible for knowing the Torah. God gave you the Torah for a reason. And by the way, our forum in between the services is all about the Torah today. So if you want to hear something about it, this is the day to go. You are responsible for knowing. And once you have learned, then you're responsible for acting. Which is why it is so heartening that after they saw and recognized that it is Jesus who was with them, they didn't just sit around the fire and say, oh, that's really cool. They got up and they moved. And they went back and they said, we have seen the risen Christ, alleluia. And everybody said, yeah, we know. Because the risen Christ is made known to us, even if only in the breaking of the bread. Amen.